Celeste Arden dumped Grace Bennett's heavy bag onto the marble table and called the housekeeper a thief. Julian had watched Grace leave with unexplained bags for 3 weeks, so even he hesitated. Then, 6-year-old Sophie pointed at Celeste and whispered. She said, "Don't tell Daddy." Grace refused to reveal where the food was going, while Celeste demanded her removal. That night, Julian followed Grace into a dark church basement in a neighborhood his company had emptied. Stay with this story until he discovers who had truly been taking from whom. 3 weeks before the accusation, the Mercer mansion woke before sunrise. The lake, beyond its glass walls, lay dark and still. Grace Bennett was already in the kitchen. She moved quietly between the stove and the breakfast table. She prepared eggs for Julian and warm oatmeal for Sophie. She had done some version of that morning for 26 years. When Julian was 9 and woke crying after his mother's death, Grace had sat beside him until dawn. She never mentioned it afterward. She simply stayed. Now Julian barely looked up from his phone. He answered messages while Grace poured his coffee. Across the table, Sophie described a dream about a yellow boat and a purple dog. She waited for her father to respond. Julian kept typing. After a few seconds, Sophie turned toward Grace and repeated the dream. Grace listened as if nothing else mattered. "What happened to the dog?" she asked. Sophie smiled. Julian only looked up when the child laughed. Grace noticed. She always noticed. Later that afternoon, Sophie followed Grace toward the service hall. "Will you be here tonight?" she asked. "Not tonight, sweetheart." Grace smiled gently. "But I'll see you in the morning." She peeled a small paper sun sticker from a sheet and pressed it into Sophie's palm. Then she entered the pantry. When Grace came out, she was carrying a heavy canvas bag. Julian happened to be crossing the glass hallway. He stopped. Grace had arrived that morning with only her handbag. Now the canvas bag pulled against both her hands. "What do you have there?" Julian asked. Grace glanced down. "Things that won't be needed here, Mr. Mercer." She offered a tired smile and continued toward the staff entrance. Julian watched her leave. Across the hallway, Celeste Arden watched too. Celeste ran the mansion with calm authority. She approved household purchases. She managed staff schedules. She handled problems before Julian ever heard about them. That was why he trusted her. That afternoon, she stood inside his private office with a tablet against her cream-colored suit. "The final River Street residents have been successfully relocated," she said. "Mercer River House will open on schedule." The project would replace several aging apartment buildings with a glass luxury tower near the water. The families who lived there had been promised temporary rooms while new housing was prepared. Julian knew that much. He had never asked for their names. He had never asked where those temporary rooms were. "Any remaining problems?" he asked. Nothing significant. A message flashed across Celeste's screen. Julian caught only a few words. "Families still gathering near Street Matthew." Celeste turned the tablet face down. "The opening team needs your final approval tomorrow," she said quickly. Julian nodded and returned to his email. Grace entered with coffee. She set the cup beside him just as Celeste added, "Every resident has been safely placed." Grace's hand paused. Only for a second. Then she straightened the saucer and stepped away. Julian did not notice. Sophie appeared at the office door holding a drawing. "Daddy, can you look?" Julian raised one finger without lifting his eyes. "In a minute." Sophie waited. The minute never came. She looked toward Grace instead. "Can you help me?" Celeste's expression tightened. "Grace is working, Sophie." But Grace had already turned toward the child. "I have a minute." Sophie brightened. Celeste watched them leave together. Then she lifted her tablet and deleted the message notification. 2 days later, the mansion hosted an investor lunch. The guests left half-eaten plates in the dining room and untouched trays in the service pantry. Chef Mateo Ruiz separated the opened food from the sealed containers. "These go in the trash," he said. He pointed to wrapped bread, unopened fruit cups, and covered meals. Grace looked at the full bin. "All of it? House policy." Mateo shrugged. "We cannot serve it again." Grace hesitated. "May I take the sealed food?" Mateo looked at her, then nodded. "I'll write it on the disposal sheet." Grace thanked him and began packing the containers into 2 paper bags. From her own shopping sack, she added milk, apples, and a loaf of inexpensive bread. Earlier that morning, she had stood in the grocery aisle, comparing prices before choosing the smaller carton of milk. She counted every dollar. Still, she bought it. Sophie wandered into the pantry holding her sticker sheet. "That is a lot of dinner." Grace smiled. "It is. Who eats it?" Grace placed one hand on the child's shoulder. "Some children who need supper." Sophie's face became serious. She chose 2 bright sun stickers. Then she pressed one onto each paper bag. "So they know it is happy food." Grace swallowed. "Yes, sweetheart." The pantry door opened. Celeste stood there. Her eyes moved from Grace to the food. Then they moved to Mateo's clipboard. "What is happening?" Mateo explained that the sealed food was marked for disposal. Celeste gave him a thin smile. "Of course." Mateo returned to the kitchen. Celeste looked at Grace again. The warmth had left her face. Grace tied the bags closed. This time, her hands were not steady. The pattern continued. On Tuesday evening, Julian saw Grace leave through the staff entrance with 1 heavy canvas bag. On Thursday, there were 2. The following Monday, he watched from his study window as she struggled to lift another into a taxi. Each time, Grace had arrived carrying almost nothing. Each time, she left with bags from inside his house. Julian hated the thought forming in his mind. Grace had taught him not to lie. When he was 10, she had marched him back into a shop after he accidentally left with an unpaid toy. She made him return it himself. But the bags were real. So were Celeste's reports. "There are unexplained pantry shortages," Celeste told him one evening. She placed a printed list on his desk. Bread, milk, juice, sealed meals. The dates matched the nights Grace carried bags away. Julian stared at the page. Could the kitchen records be wrong? "Possibly," Celeste said. Then she sat across from him. But loyalty sometimes makes wealthy families ignore what they would see clearly in a stranger. The sentence stayed with him. That night, Sophie climbed onto the chair beside Julian. "Grace gives the bags to children." Julian looked up. "What children?" "The supper children." He assumed it came from one of Grace's bedtime stories. "Sophie, I'm working." Her shoulders lowered. She waited another moment. Then she climbed down. Julian returned to the list. From then on, he noticed every bag, but he did not ask Grace another honest question. He watched her instead. Late one afternoon, Sophie sat at the small staff table near the pantry. She colored a house with a yellow sun above it. The service door stood partly open. Inside, Grace packed another canvas bag. Celeste entered and closed the door almost completely. "You were told to stop," she said. Grace kept folding the paper bags. "The children still need food." Those families are no longer Julian's concern. They were promised 3 months. Celeste stepped closer. "The project opens on time." Her voice stayed controlled. "That is what matters." Grace finally looked at her. "Does Mr. Mercer know they were removed?" Celeste's face hardened. "If you mention them to Julian, you will lose this job." Grace did not move. "And the church?" she asked. "I can have that basement cleared within a day." Behind the half-open door, Sophie stopped coloring. Grace turned to close the canvas bag. Sophie watched Celeste reach for the clipboard. Celeste removed Grace's written food authorization. Then she folded it once and placed it inside her pocket. When Grace looked back, Celeste raised one finger to her lips. "Do not tell Julian about those families." She walked out without seeing the child. Sophie remained frozen. The yellow crayon slipped from her hand. Grace found her a moment later. "Did I do something bad?" Sophie whispered. "No." Grace knelt beside her. "You did nothing wrong." Sophie looked toward the door Celeste had used. That evening, she began a new drawing. It showed Grace beside a large brown bag. It showed Celeste in a red coat, and one small finger covered Celeste's mouth. Before Sophie could explain the picture, Celeste struck first. The accusation did not begin with shouting. It began with silence. Celeste intercepted Grace near the staff entrance during a formal operations briefing. She carried the canvas bag into the service dining room. Then she dropped it onto the marble table. The sealed meals, bread, juice boxes, and folded paper bags spilled beneath the cold white lights. Several carried Sophie's yellow sun stickers. The staff stared. Then they looked away. One young server opened her mouth as if she might speak. Celeste turned toward her. The server lowered her eyes. Celeste placed the altered inventory list beside the food. "These items were recorded missing," she said. Grace stood with her hands at her sides. She did not reach for the bags. She did not defend herself. Her silence hurt Julian more than anger would have. Celeste asked permission to search Grace's locker and personal things. Julian looked at the food again. Nothing inside the bag was expensive. There was no silver, no jewelry, no bottle from the wine room. Everything looked prepared for children. Small portions, juice boxes, paper bags folded with care. Celeste saw his hesitation. "The packaging proves nothing," she said. "Anyone could make theft appear charitable." Grace finally looked at Julian. He remembered her holding his hand at his mother's funeral. He remembered her teaching him that honesty mattered when no one was watching. But he also remembered every heavy bag leaving his mansion. Sophie entered before anyone could stop her. She moved past Celeste and stood beside Grace. Then she took Grace's hand. Everyone else had stepped away. The child moved closer. Sophie stared at Celeste with fixed attention. It was the look of a child remembering something frightening but incomplete. She said, "Don't tell Daddy," Sophie whispered. Celeste turned too quickly. "What did you say?" Sophie pointed at her. "Those families." The room changed. Julian looked from his daughter to Celeste. Celeste gave a short laugh. There was no warmth in it. Sophie heard part of a private staff conversation. "She did this," Sophie said. Her finger remained raised. Grace lowered herself beside the child. "You do not have to say anything else." Celeste's eyes sharpened. "That sounds like coaching." Grace stood again. "I have never asked Sophie to speak for me." Celeste looked at Julian. "This is exactly why the situation must be handled now." She gestured toward Grace. "She has blurred every boundary in this house." Sophie pressed herself against Grace's side. Julian noticed. He also noticed something else. Celeste had not calmly asked what Sophie heard. She had only tried to stop her from saying more. "What families?" Julian asked. Grace remained silent. Sophie touched one finger to her lips. "Like this," she said. Celeste's face tightened. Julian felt the first crack in the story before him. The food records suggested Grace had taken something. The child suggested Celeste had hidden something. Both could not be innocent. Yet neither truth was complete. Julian dismissed the staff and asked Grace to come with him. Sophie tried to follow. Celeste blocked the doorway with one arm. For the first time, Sophie pulled away from her. Inside Julian's study, Grace remained standing. Julian closed the door. Did you take food from this house? Yes. The answer struck harder because she gave it without hesitation. Grace explained that the sealed meals had been marked for disposal. Chef Mateo had allowed her to take them. She also bought bread, milk, fruit, and other supplies with her own wages. Julian looked toward the door. There is no written approval. There was. Celeste says there wasn't. Grace's expression barely changed. That was worse. Who receives the food? Julian asked. Grace said nothing. Grace, I am trying to help you. No, Mr. Mercer. Her voice remained steady. You are trying to decide whether I embarrassed you. His jaw tightened. You carried food out of my home for 3 weeks and refused to explain why? If I give you their names before you understand, they will become another problem for someone to remove. The words landed between them. Julian heard accusation. Grace meant warning. He remembered being 12 and hiding a broken lamp. Grace had made him confess before his father found it. Now the woman who taught him honesty would not trust him with a list of names. Do you believe I would harm them? Grace looked at him for a long moment. I believe you stopped asking what happened after your decisions were made. Outside the study, Celeste waited. When Grace left, she entered immediately. People who resell stolen food never identify their buyers, she said. Julian did not answer. He was no longer certain Grace was the only one hiding something. Celeste wanted Grace's access revoked that night. She wanted security called. She wanted the matter documented before Julian could change his mind. Julian refused to involve the police without proof. But he made another choice, a quieter one, and it wounded Grace just as deeply. Do not return until I understand what happened. Grace stood before his desk in the uniform she had worn inside his family's home for decades. She reached toward the ring at her waist. One by one, she removed the kitchen key and the service entrance key. Then, she removed the small brass key to Sophie's room. She placed them beside Julian's hand. The sound was soft. It filled the room. Julian stared at Sophie's key. Grace had carried it since the child was an infant. She had used it during fevers and nightmares. Now she slid it away from herself without a word. Celeste watched from near the door, satisfied. Grace looked at Julian. The truth will hurt you more than it hurts me. Then she turned away. Celeste offered to arrange a company car. Grace declined. I know how to get home. Sophie ran into the corridor before Grace reached the staff exit. She carried the unfinished drawing against her chest. Take it, she begged. Grace saw the red-coated figure and the raised finger. She folded Sophie's hands around the paper. No, sweetheart. She held the child's gaze. You keep it safe. Are you coming back? Grace could not answer. She kissed Sophie's forehead and walked outside. Sophie turned toward Julian. He reached for her. She stepped back. Then Celeste called for a driver anyway. From the window, Julian saw Grace refuse the waiting black car. She walked toward the main road alone. Julian looked down at the keys on his desk. For the first time, Celeste's victory made him uneasy. The following evening, Mateo met Grace at the staff gate and handed her one final bag. Julian waited in a car parked beyond the mansion gates. He told himself he was confirming the truth, but shame had already begun to follow him. Grace walked to a modest grocery store. Through the window, Julian watched her place bread, milk, apples, vegetables, and soup ingredients on the counter. She checked the total twice. Then, she set one item aside and chose a cheaper brand. She paid with her own bank card. No mansion account, no hidden cash. Her own money. She added the groceries to the canvas bags and carried them toward a public bus stop. Julian followed from a distance. Rain tapped against his windshield as the bus moved away from the lake. It entered the old river district. The streets grew darker. Storefronts stood empty beneath faded signs. Several buildings were boarded behind new construction fences. Farther ahead, Mercer River House rose above them in glass and gold light. Julian's name was already fixed to the entrance. Grace stepped off the bus 3 blocks away. She carried the bags toward St. Matthew Community Church. Celeste called Julian. Then she called again. Her messages became sharper. "Where are you? Do not approach Grace alone. Call me immediately." Julian stared at the screen. Celeste did not know where he was, but she clearly feared what he might find. He turned the phone face down. Grace descended the concrete steps beside the church. A basement door opened. Warm light reached into the rain. Julian crossed the street and moved toward a low window. Inside, small hands reached across folding tables. One child lifted a paper bag marked with Sophie's yellow sun. Julian stopped breathing. Grace had not been hiding what she took from him. She had been hiding the people waiting for it. Julian remained outside the basement window for several seconds. He could not move. Inside, Grace stood behind a dented soup pot. She served each person as if she had known them for years. She called an elderly woman Mrs. Carter. She remembered that Mrs. Carter needed soft bread. She gave a tired father an extra container for his night shift. Then she knelt beside a little girl in an oversized blue coat. The child was about Sophie's age. "Here you are, Maya," Grace said. Maya accepted a bowl with both hands. A yellow sun sticker rested on the paper bag beside her. Sophie's sticker. Grace tucked a napkin beneath Maya's bowl. She used the same patient motion she used when Sophie spilled her oatmeal. Julian finally opened the basement door. Conversation faded. Grace looked up. The ladle stopped in her hand. She did not appear frightened, only disappointed. Several adults recognized Julian immediately. Their eyes moved toward the windows. The golden lights of Mercer River House glowed above the dark rooftops. His name was written across that building. No one thanked him for coming. Maya looked at Grace. "Can Mommy and me sleep somewhere warm tonight?" Julian felt the question close around his throat. These were not thieves. They were not strangers Grace invented to excuse herself. They were families, children, people waiting for food his mansion would have thrown away. The bags had never carried wealth away from him. They had carried dignity toward people his world had forgotten. When the meal line slowed, Reverend Thomas Reed approached Julian. He was a tired man, with rolled sleeves and a patient voice. "These families came from the old River Street apartments," he said. Mercer Development had purchased those buildings months earlier. The residents were promised 3 months of temporary housing, while permanent places were prepared. "That was handled," Julian said. The words sounded weak before they left his mouth. Reverend Reed shook his head. They were given motel rooms for 1 week. After that, the families were told the support had ended. One mother explained that she had moved between relatives for several nights. Another family had slept inside their car until it was taken away. Mrs. Lewis rested one hand on Maya's shoulder. "My daughter sleeps with her shoes on now," she said. "She thinks someone will make us leave again before morning." Julian looked down. Maya's wet shoes were still tied tightly. Even inside the warm basement, he had approved the project. He had approved the relocation plan. But he had never asked where anyone went. Maya stepped closer, still holding her folded meal bag. A white envelope showed from her mother's coat pocket. Julian recognized the Mercer logo. Maya pointed toward it. "The red coat lady said you wanted us gone." The room became still. Julian lowered himself slightly. "What red coat lady?" Maya looked toward the basement door. "The lady from the motel." She did not know Celeste's title. She did not understand schedules or openings. She only remembered the bright red coat and the sentence spoken beside her mother. Julian remembered Sophie's drawing. A red figure, a raised finger, a warning not to tell Daddy. His name had been used here, not to protect these people, to frighten them. Grace waited until the families finished eating before speaking to Julian. They stood inside the small church kitchen. The walls were faded. The shelves held donated cans and mismatched cups. "Why didn't you come to me?" Julian asked. Grace cleaned the ladle before answering. "I tried." She reminded him of 2 mornings when she mentioned River Street. The first time, Julian had been leaving for a meeting. He told her Celeste handled community matters. The second time, he answered a call before Grace finished speaking. He did not remember either moment. Grace remembered both. "Celeste said you approved the shortened housing," she continued. "She said the project mattered more than the delay. I never approved that, but I had no reason to know that." Julian flinched. Grace looked through the kitchen doorway toward the families. Feeding them was easier than asking them to trust a man who had never learned their names. "I would have helped." "Would you?" There was no anger in her voice. That made it worse. Grace told him Celeste had threatened her job. She had also threatened to clear the church if Grace spoke. "Sophie heard her," Grace said. "She should never have been placed in the middle of this." Julian thought of his daughter stepping away from him. "Does Sophie still have the drawing?" "She should." Grace's phone vibrated. A church volunteer had sent a message from upstairs. 2 black security vehicles had stopped outside. Grace read the final line twice. Celeste was with them. Julian looked toward the basement entrance. Grace did not ask him to save her. She had already learned not to depend on promises. This time, he would have to act before asking for trust. Reverend Reed led Julian into the church office. It was barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs. "I saved something," the Reverend said. He unlocked his phone and opened a voicemail. The instructions did not sound right. Julian saw Celeste's name on the screen. Reed explained that she called after the families began sleeping near the church. She ordered him to stop sheltering them. She also claimed Julian wanted the building cleared before Mercer River House opened. "Why didn't you send this to me?" "I tried your office." Reed's answer was quiet. Celeste returned the call. Julian stared at the phone. Again, someone had tried to reach him. Again, Celeste stood between him and the consequences of his company. Reed moved his thumb toward the play button. A violent pounding struck the basement door. Maya cried out. Julian and Reed rushed into the main room. Grace had already stepped in front of the children. She did not hesitate. She placed her body between them and the entrance. It was the same instinct she had shown toward Sophie for years. The pounding came again. "Mercer Security," a voice called. "Open the door." Julian heard Celeste speak from the stairwell. She sounded calm, certain, as if the building already belonged to her. Reed tightened his grip around the phone. Julian looked at Grace. Then he looked at the frightened families behind her. He finally understood why Sophie trusted Grace first. Grace listened. Grace remembered. Grace stayed. The basement door opened. Celeste entered wearing a deep red coat. Celeste stopped when she saw Julian. The surprise lasted less than a second. Then her professional smile returned. "Thank God you are safe," she said. She claimed Grace had brought stolen mansion property into an unauthorized shelter. She ordered the 2 security officers to collect every food bag. Then she told the families they had to leave. "This church is scheduled for acquisition," Celeste said. "The basement must be cleared tonight." Maya hid behind Grace. Grace did not move. Neither did the security officers. They were watching Julian now. Celeste pointed toward Maya's mother. "Mrs. Lewis, you were already removed from the Lakeside Motor Lodge after violating the temporary placement rules." Julian turned slowly. Celeste had told him she knew nothing about the families near the church. Yet she knew Maya's last name. She knew the exact motel. She knew when the family had been removed. Celeste realized her mistake. Too late. Reverend Reed raised his phone. Celeste saw the open voicemail screen. Her calm expression vanished. That recording is unauthorized. She stepped forward. Give me the phone. Reed moved back. Celeste reached again. Julian stepped between them. No raised voice. No threat. Just a wall she could not pass. Mr. Mercer, this is company business. Julian looked at the security officers. Then he looked at the bags marked with Sophie's yellow suns. No one leaves, he said. His eyes returned to Celeste. And nothing gets deleted. If you were Julian in that moment, would you protect Grace now? Press 1, or wait for the full evidence? Press 2. Julian kept his body between Celeste and Reverend Reed's phone. Then he called the mansion. One of the senior staff members answered and brought Sophie to the screen. She was still holding the unfinished drawing. Julian lowered his voice. Can you show me what you made? Sophie lifted the paper toward the camera. The lines were uneven. The figures were simple, but the meaning was clear. Grace stood beside a large brown bag. Celeste wore a bright red coat. One finger covered her mouth. Julian looked at Celeste. She had arrived at the church wearing the same color. What did she say? He asked. Sophie glanced toward the staff member beside her. Then she looked back at her father. Don't tell Daddy about the families. Celeste shook her head. Grace put those words in her mind. Grace remained across the room beside Maya. She said nothing. Julian asked Sophie one more question. Did Grace tell you what to draw? No. What did Grace say? Sophie thought for a moment. She said I did nothing bad. That was all. No adult explanation. No rehearsed story. Just what a frightened child had heard. Julian understood why Grace returned the drawing instead of keeping it. She had protected Sophie from becoming her defense. Celeste had done the opposite. She tried to turn Sophie's confusion into silence. Julian looked into the screen. Thank you for telling me. Sophie studied his face. Is Grace coming home? Julian glanced toward Grace. I need to make things right first. For once, he did not dismiss his daughter. He listened. Julian called Chef Mateo and placed the phone on speaker. Mateo answered from the mansion kitchen. Julian asked one clear question. Did Grace have permission to take the sealed food? Yes, Mateo said immediately. It was marked for disposal. Celeste interrupted. There was no authorization. Mateo went quiet. Then his voice hardened. I wrote one. He explained that Celeste entered the pantry after Grace packed the meals. She took the signed sheet from the clipboard. Mateo assumed she needed it for the records. Now everyone understood where it had gone. The security officers and church volunteers looked toward Grace. The families did too. The woman accused of stealing stood beside the children she had fed. No one looked away from her now. Grace's name was clear, but the deeper lie remained. Reverend Reed pressed play on the voicemail. Celeste's recorded voice filled the basement. The River Street families leave the motel after this week. The message continued. The tower opens on schedule. Then came the final sentence. Tell the church Julian Mercer does not want them near the property. The recording ended. No one spoke. Celeste looked around the room for someone who still believed her. There was no one. Then she stopped pretending. The delays would have cost millions, she said. The opening could not move again. You promised them 3 months, Julian replied. I protected the project. You used my name. I made the decision you would have made. That sentence cut deeper than every other lie. Celeste had believed his indifference would protect her. Maya tugged Grace's sleeve. Are they still making us leave? Julian turned toward the child. No. Then he looked at Maya's mother and Reverend Reed. No one is removing any family tonight. Celeste gave a bitter laugh. You are destroying your business for people who contribute nothing. Julian looked around the basement. Then he looked at Grace. No, he said. I nearly destroyed people because I refused to see them. Justice did not wait for morning. Julian removed Celeste from every position she held. He instructed the security officers to secure her company phone. He ordered them to preserve the records. Then he told them to escort her away from the staff and the project files. Celeste stared at the two men she had brought to remove the families. Now they stood beside her. "You will regret humiliating me like this," she said. Julian did not raise his voice. "You humiliated Grace in my home, using evidence you altered." He looked toward the families. "And you used my authority to frighten people who had already lost theirs." Celeste warned that the opening would become a public disaster. Julian answered with action. He called his housing team. He ordered safe temporary apartments for every displaced family that night. The original 3-month promise would be restored immediately. No family would be charged. No one would be forced to move again without real notice and a safe destination. Reverend Reed began writing down names. This time, Julian asked for them. He listened as each family spoke. Then he made one more decision. Every household displaced from River Street would receive a genuine right to return when the new homes were ready. Not a vague invitation, a guaranteed place. Maya looked up at him. "Can Mommy unpack our bags?" Julian turned to her mother, instead of making another child carry an adult promise. "Yes," he told Mrs. Lewis. "My team will take you somewhere safe tonight." He nodded toward Reverend Reed. "And he will remain involved." The security officers opened the basement doors, but no one was being removed. They guarded the families while the arrangements were made. Before dawn, Julian told every mansion employee who had witnessed the accusation that Grace had been framed and had never stolen from the house. The power in the room had changed. For the first time, it protected the people at the bottom. The next morning, the Mercer kitchen felt different. There were no staff briefings, no polished reports, only Julian, Grace, Sophie, and the house keys resting on the table. Julian pushed the ring toward Grace. "I watched you like a criminal," he said. "I trusted a list over the woman who raised me." Grace looked at the keys, but did not touch them. Julian noticed the small brass key to Sophie's room. Restoring that key could not restore what he had broken. He apologized for suspending Grace. He apologized for allowing Celeste to shame her. He apologized for ignoring every warning until he saw the suffering himself. "I want you to come back," he said. Grace's expression remained steady. "To what?" The question stopped him. Grace explained that returning to the old arrangement would change nothing. The problem was larger than Celeste. Staff members needed a safe way to report abuse. They could not be forced to complain through the person harming them. Unused food needed a clear donation process. Household workers needed proper health and retirement support. Residents affected by Mercer projects needed a real voice before decisions were made. And no worker could be punished for speaking. Julian agreed to every condition, not as favors, as rules. Sophie moved closer to Grace. "Are you still our family?" Grace knelt beside her. Families listened to each other. Sophie looked at Julian. He nodded. "We are learning." Grace finally reached toward the table, but she did not take the old ring. She selected one new key. The key to Street Matthews' kitchen. "I will help build something better," she said, "but I will not return to being invisible." Julian accepted that. It was not forgiveness without consequence. It was a beginning with boundaries. Several months later, warm light filled the renovated Street Matthew community kitchen. The old walls had been repaired. The folding tables remained, because Grace said they belonged to the history of the place. Local workers now received wages for preparing meals. Residents helped decide where the food went. They also decided what support families needed. Grace directed the program. Julian carried boxes. He no longer arrived for photographs and left before learning anyone's name. Nearby, the first affordable homes connected to Mercer River House were almost complete. The displaced families held priority return places. Maya and her mother already lived in a safe apartment. Maya no longer slept in her shoes. That evening, Julian stood beside Grace, serving soup. "Mr. Carter needs the softer bread," Grace reminded him. Julian nodded. He remembered. Sophie sat at the end of the table with her sticker sheet. She pressed one yellow sun onto the final canvas bag. Then she carried it toward her father. "Who gets this one?" Months earlier, Julian would have answered from a list. This time, he lifted the bag. "Let's ask." Grace watched him. "Good answer, Julian." It was the first time she had used only his name. Sophie took one handle. Julian took the other. Together, they carried the same kind of bag that had once made him suspect the woman who loved him. Now it moved openly through the light, not as stolen property, not as charity meant to make a billionaire feel generous. It carried food, dignity, and a question Julian had finally learned to ask. "What do you need?" If this story touched your heart, like this video and subscribe to Billionaire Justice Stories for more stories where the truth finally protects the innocent. And tell me in the comments what you would have done when Sophie first warned her father.